Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to AlphaBiolabs' latest webinar, The Right Test at the Right Time, Drug and Alcohol Testing for Every Scenario. It's great to have so many of you join us this afternoon. So for those of you who've not seen me on one of these webinars before, my name's Andrew Priestley, and I'm the Legal Marketing Manager at AlphaBiolabs, and I'll oversee the running of the webinar today. I'm delighted to be joined by my two colleagues. We've got Ashley Friday, who's our Sample Collections Manager, and Sam Evans, who's one of our toxicology reporting scientists. In terms of the agenda, we've got around about 40 minutes. So in a moment, I'm going to hand over to Ashley, who's going to talk about the various drug and alcohol testing methods available and when and how to use them. For drug testing in particular, Ashley will break it down between what we call wide window and narrow window tests and why you should consider combining the two. Sam will then focus on our expert reports. She'll give you an overview of the structure of the reports, and also she's going to refer to a couple of real-world case studies for the successful application of drug and alcohol testing for legal matters. We'll then conclude, as ever, with our Q&A. If you've got any questions, then please do use the Q&A facility during the webinar to ask them. We have had a number of questions come in as part of the registration, so we will answer those at the end. If we don't get a chance to answer your question, then don't worry, we will send you an email with an answer within the next 24 hours. So please feel free to ask as many questions as you would like. And with that, I'm going to hand over to Ashley.
Hello, welcome to the webinar. As Andrew mentioned, we're going to start off talking about wide window drug testing. So the first part of this presentation will be all about drug testing specifically, and then my colleague Sam will talk you through a drug testing expert report, and then we'll move on to alcohol testing. So for this first section, the options that we discuss are purely based on if you are looking to undertake drug testing. So looking at the wide window of detection, the first one that we would recommend to do if you have a choice of different samples to collect would be to do a head-hair test. The reason for this is we can apply a more accurate growth rate to head hair, we can break it down a lot further. It just gives you a few more options in relation to time frame and how specific testing results can be. So as recommended by the Society of Hair Testing, head hair grows at an average rate of 1 centimetre per month. That means that if you had a client who had 12 centimetres of head hair available, that you could look back up to 12 months. And that would be the maximum time frame that you could look back for a drug test in head hair. As I mentioned, you'd need 12 centimetres of head hair, so it is dependent on what sample your client has available, but best possible scenario is we can go back up to 12 months. And this is looking for persistent drug users. So it's not looking at kind of one-off drug use. That would be more your narrow window of detection, which we'll come on to shortly. This would be more looking at patterns and trends within someone's drug use, and how you kind of decide on what type of test you have will be based on what you're looking to prove or disprove. So for drug testing in head hair, we're going to have a look at 3 main types of options. We can do an overview analysis, a month-by-month segmented analysis, or a bi-monthly segmented analysis. And I'll keep referring back to this, but whichever one you go for will completely depend on what you're trying to prove. They all fit different types of situations very well. They don't necessarily work in other types of situations. So it's purely about what you're trying to establish from these results as to which would be the most beneficial. So if we start off by looking at an overview analysis, so this can be done looking back up to 12 months, depending on your client, the length of your client's hair, based on that 1 centimetre per month rule. So if you had someone who had 12 centimetres, you could go back up to 12 months. If they had, for example, 3 centimetres, you could go back up to 3 months. And the idea of an overview analysis is that we're looking at a time frame kind of as a whole. So for an overview, we would section any hair sample, depending on length, into 3 monthly segments. So if you had a client that had 3 centimeters of head hair and you ordered an overview test, then you would get one result covering those 3 months as a whole. It wouldn't be broken down any further than that. And then if you had a client with 12 centimeters of head hair and you ordered a 12 months analysis, you would get 4 results for that time frame, each covering 3 months. So this type of analysis is really beneficial if you have a client who, for example, states that they've never used drugs and they're just trying to prove that the sample result would be negative. Instead of looking at what can be a more costly way of testing, which would be to segment it month by month, you could opt for an overview, knowing that the result was going to come out as negative. So that would be kind of the client that an overview analysis would suit the most. It does fit into other situations, but for the time that we have to discuss today, that's probably the best suited kind of client. Your next option is a month-by-month segmented analysis. So any length of head hair up to 12 centimeters, just like your overview can do. But in this case, we would break it down month by month, giving you an individual result for each month. So again, for example, if you had a client with 6 centimeters of head hair, you would get 6 months analysis. Each month would provide its own individual result. Whereas with an overview, you would get 2 results for the 6-month period. With a segmented analysis, you would get 6. This type of analysis is great for anyone who's looking at patterns and trends within a sample. So if you have a client who, for example, has stated they do use drugs, but they are trying to reduce their use, or they did use and they now abstain, and you want to look at that decrease over time, that's where a segmented analysis would be more beneficial. Because if you had a client who has said that they had used in the last 3 months, but were trying to reduce it, you wouldn't see that in an overview sample because you'd only get 1 result. Whereas you would see that in a segmented sample because you've got 3 individual results for each month. So again, it's about thinking about what your client is looking to prove by doing this type of test and which one would be more beneficial. And obviously, we're always on hand if you did need any specific advice about certain cases. And the final option is a bi-monthly segmented analysis. So this kind of falls in between the two. So this is looking at results based on a 2-monthly segmentation. So again, if you had a client that had 6 centimeters of head hair, you could do a 6-month bi-monthly segmented analysis, and you would get 3 results that would cover that time frame, as opposed to segmented, where you'd have got 6 results, or an overview where you'd have got 2 results to cover that time frame. And again, this is good for patterns and trends, but not as specific as monthly segmentation. So it's always about taking into consideration what you're looking to prove or disprove by doing the testing and which one would be more suitable for your client. So we've spoken about what we would recommend testing, which would be your head hair sample for that consistent growth rate, and the options of segmented, bi-monthly segmented, or an overview. But we know that that's not always as easy to do, particularly with clients that have really short head hair or no head hair at all. So there are some other options. All these options that we're now going to talk through are available as an overview only. So for body hair, and this includes underarm, chest, leg, back, whatever your client has available, we will take it. This would cover up to 12 months as an overview. So unfortunately, you can't segment body hair just due to the kind of difference in the growth rate. We can't apply that centimeter per month rule like we can to head hair. So it'd be up to 12 months as an overview for a body hair sample. So again, something to consider before instruction, whether that would cover exactly what your client was looking for. We can also collect samples of beard hair, dependent on the length. So we can apply a growth rate to beard hair, but it's not as kind of generic as the 1 centimeter per month. We'd need to bring it into the lab and measure it to be able to tell you exactly what time frame that would cover. But again, potentially up to 12 months if the beard hair is long enough, but only as an overview. So no segmentation for beard hair either. So I'm sure you can see why we would always recommend going with head hair if you do have that available. Gives you a lot more options for your analysis. Then we move on to nail clippings. So if your client doesn't have head hair, body hair, or a beard, your other options are to look at taking a sample of nail clippings. Again, both of these are as an overview. So fingernails would provide up to 6 months as an overview, and then toenails would provide up to 12 months as an overview. They must be clear from acrylic and nail varnish and things like that before the collection goes ahead, but it's a good alternative if you have a client who doesn't have another sample available. But again, you need to consider whether it is beneficial to your case. And usually it's beneficial to have an analysis conducted, so it might be that one of these is suitable for you. That was the wider window of detection, so we're looking at going back months to build up kind of that picture of any use. If we look briefly at the narrow window of detection, again, you need to consider whether this is suitable for the particular case that you're working on at the time. We can offer oral fluid testing. So this is that narrow window. So you're looking at up to approximately 2 days from when the sample's collected for this type of analysis. So we're not looking back historically over months like you would be with the other sample types that we'd spoken about. It would just be for that short-term 2-day window, but that may be suitable for certain clients depending on what you're looking at. It would be a saliva sample and oral fluid sample that would go to the laboratory, and then a report would be produced, tested for the substances that you decide upon instruction. We can also do testing in urine. So again, you would decide what drug groups you wanted testing for. We would collect a sample of urine, and this would cover approximately 4 days. So kind of covering some of that gap between the hair sample analysis beginning and the sample collection taking place. So you've got about 4 days for your urine sample. We can only offer this at one of our walk-in centres, but collection is free of charge there. But it's just so we can make sure samples aren't adulterated in any way. But it is another option if suitable. This table here just shows it a little bit clearer. So you've got your 2 narrow window of detections covering 2 days or 4 days as an overview. And then you've got your head hair, your body hair, your fingernails, and your toenails. Again, looking back over that longer period of time, looking back in months, up to 12 months if the sample is sufficient. So always thinking about what would be best for your client to show exactly what you're looking to prove. Some people choose to combine the two that we've just spoken about. So they'll do long-term or wide window detection, alongside narrow window. For a number of different reasons, especially if you have someone who is trying to abstain during a period of time. Head hair from ingestion to it being present in the head hair takes up to 14 days. So if, for example, you had your sample collected today, the analysis window would be from the start of June because we have to allow the 14 days of growth. So the narrow window of detection helps to bridge that gap between the two somewhat and cover the period that isn't necessarily covered by the hair or the nail testing. So some people do it for that. It also helps with a balanced assessment, including both historical drug use and recent drug use. And it prevents any misinterpretation. So if you did just go for narrow window testing, just because someone is negative for the last 2 to 4 days doesn't give you a kind of bigger picture on it over what's happened over the last few months. So it helps with any misinterpretation on that as well. So they do complement each other well in the right situations. So that concludes the drug testing part and what samples are available. Sam's now going to talk you through what's in an expert report in relation to drug testing.
From this point on, we'll be walking through the key sections of an expert report. This part of the presentation is designed to show how we present and interpret toxicology findings for court use and how we ensure each report is robust, impartial, and legally defensible. So there are 2 formats we use for reporting. The first is a certificate of analysis. So this just contains only lab results with no interpretation, and it's purely factual. The second is the expert report. So this includes the interpretation and contextual information. So these reports are suitable for court proceedings. Expert reports are written by trained toxicologists. They're impartial and independent, and they follow Part 25 of the Family Procedure Rules. They're designed to be practical and readable for non-scientific professionals such as judges, solicitors, and social workers. In this section, we explore the use of head-hair drug testing and its interpretation using a real-world example. So this particular case was tested for cannabis and cocaine for a period of 3 months, segmented month by month, so a 3 by 1 centimetre section. So this is one of the most important pages in the report and is placed as the first page straight after the title page. So our conclusions provide a clear summary of the findings, for example, whether drug use was indicated during the period analysed or whether the results were negative. We include any relevant commentary, for example, whether the results are consistent with repeated use, show evidence of cessation, or suggest a particular pattern. Language here is always evidence-based and non-judgmental. And if factors such as cosmetic hair treatments or any other external influences may have impacted the results, we ensure this is clearly highlighted in our interpretation. Then we have the request of analysis table. So this table shows exactly what was requested at the time of instruction, includes the sample type, the sample length, the substances or drug groups requested, and how many months were to be analysed. It confirms whether the analysis aligns with the original instruction, and if not, we explain why, such as insufficient hair length, for example. This just ensures transparency between what was asked and what was delivered. Then we have the donor and sample information. So this section includes the sample donor's full name and date of birth, plus the sample collection and receipt dates. It also records who collected the sample, confirms whether the chain of custody was intact, and includes a photograph of the donor as well photo ID was provided. If there are any issues, like an unclear chain of custody, we contact the instructing party. If it can't be resolved, a recollection may then be necessary. Then we have the sample donor disclosures. So these are the declarations made by the donor at the time of sample collection. They include drug use history, any prescribed or over-the-counter medications, any potential environmental exposure to drugs, any cosmetic hair treatments like dyeing or bleaching, and all this information is critical to interpreting the results. So for example, if environmental exposure is declared, wash samples are retained for 3 months for testing if required. And in certain cases, the wash samples can help differentiate between external contamination and systemic cocaine use by identifying the presence or absence of drug residues on the hair surface, thereby supporting a more robust interpretation of the results. So this is the drug analysis and results table. So this section presents the lab data in a clear and readable format. It shows each segment results and the corresponding approximate time period. We explain what the concentration ranges mean and note any results above the cutoff, which are classified as positive results. Anything below the analytical cutoff is reported as negative. So here you often see drug trends in use, such as rising or falling concentrations across the segments. This particular case study involved segmented hair analysis to detect cocainous metabolites. So at the time of sample collection, the sample donor did not declare any use of cocaine. But as you can see in segment S3, it tested positive for cocaine and the primary cocaine metabolite benzylecgonine, or BZE, above their respective cutoffs, with a benzylecgonine to cocaine ratio greater than 5%, which is indicative of drug metabolism and therefore systemic use. However, hair segment S2 showed cocaine alone above its cutoff, but no benzylecgonine, meaning we cannot definitively confirm use just based on this hair segment alone. However, this segment corresponds to a time where the sample donor has disclosed bleaching their hair. So bleaching itself can affect more polar metabolites like benzylecgonine when compared to cocaine, which is more lipophilic and then more stable in the hair shaft. So hair segment S2 matched the visual colour change observed in the hair sample at about 1.2 centimetres from the root. So in this case, although benzylecgonine wasn't detected above the cutoff in segment S2, it's plausible that it had been degraded due to the bleach, which supports that cocaine was likely from use within or prior to the approximate time period covered by that segment. Hair segment S1 tested negative for cocaine and its metabolites, and there was a reduction seen in the concentrations of cocaine and benzylecgonine from S3 to S1, which potentially indicates cessation of cocaine use over time. So there's a few learning points here, including to consider cosmetic hair treatments like bleaching when interpreting results, as they can distort the concentration patterns and impact metabolite detection. We rely on metabolite ratios when they are present, and to treat cocaine-only findings with caution and contextualise them using surrounding segment results and client disclosures. Then we have the other information that's included in our expert report, including the qualifications and declarations. So this part establishes the credibility of the reporting scientist, includes a name, qualifications, and a statement confirming independence, that is, no conflict of interest. So this just provides reassurance of the court that the interpretation has been carried out by a qualified, impartial expert. Then we have our technical information section. So this is where we include technical notes at the end of each expert report for transparency and scrutiny. So these cover a number of areas like drug analysis information. So this details which substances were tested and the methods that were used. The hair growth raises and rates. So we work on an average growth rate of 1 centimetre per month, which is conservative and standardised. So this is widely accepted across the industry because it fairly represents all ethnicities and hair types and supports consistent interpretation across cases. Then we have the drug incorporation in hair. So this explains how drug enter the hair via blood, sweat, and sebum. It also touches on how individual physiology, including hair colour and melanin affinity, can influence incorporation. Then we have the range of drugs detected. So we clarify that we cannot translate concentrations into exact dosages or frequency. Instead, we compare results to known patterns across thousands of previous cases. Then we have the external exposure and washing procedures. So this outlines our use of washing protocols designed to reduce and remove any possible environmental contamination from the hair surface. Then we have the cosmetic hair treatments and thermal hair straightening sections. This highlights how dyeing, bleaching, or heat treatments can potentially affect drug and alcohol biomarker results, and we adjust our interpretation accordingly. Then we have our cutoff value section. So this is a particularly important section. We use both analytical cutoffs and Society of Hair Testing cutoffs. So the SOHT cutoffs are internationally recognised, peer-reviewed standards agreed by global experts. So these help us classify results as positive or negative while accounting for measurement uncertainty. So together, the Society of Hair Testing thresholds and analytical cutoffs help us ensure results are accurate, fair, and defensible in court. So altogether, this technical section demonstrates that our reports are thorough, scientifically grounded, and compliant with ISO 17025 UCAS accreditation. And I will now pass you back to Ashley, who will take you through the alcohol testing section.
Okay, so we spoke about drug testing just a couple of minutes ago, and now the rest of this presentation will refer to the alcohol side of things and what your options are for alcohol testing. So they do differ slightly to drug testing. So for alcohol, we're looking at chronic and excessive consumption of alcohol. And just to kind of put a bit of context to that, the World Health Organization define chronic and excessive consumption as consuming more than 7.5 units on average on a daily basis for over 2 or more months. So this is what we're looking at. We can, as we talk, offer other types of testing which is lower than chronic and excessive, but when we're looking at head-her, this is what we're referring to. We can also test for abstinence depending on the sample type over certain periods of time as well. So I'm going to talk about a few different options, and then there's some nice table summaries that kind of break it down for you and make it a little bit easier to understand what your options are. So once alcohol is ingested and it enters the body, it's absorbed into the bloodstream and then comes out through a head-her sample, a little bit like drug testing. This process takes up to 14 days, and this is what I was referring to earlier about that little gap, where if you gave your sample today, the period of analysis would cover from earlier June looking back, because that's how long that process takes for it to be detectable in a hair sample. As it grows, 2 biomarkers are incorporated into the hair. So you've got your ETG and your ETPA, and then they remain on the hair as it grows, which is what allows us to identify it over longer periods of time. So the two testing options that you've got, you've got your ETG, which is water soluble, which means that they're affected by different things. So for ETG, hair cosmetic treatments such as bleaches, dyes, perms, excessive washing could potentially decrease the levels of ETG that could be detected in the hair sample. And we do ask questions about cosmetic treatments that people have used at the time of collection, but this is why it's really important to do ETG alongside ETPA where possible, because they're affected by different things. So by doing the two together, it allows us to compare the results. So with your ETPA, this is fat soluble. So instead of being affected by bleaches, perms and dyes, it can be affected by hairstyling products that contain alcohol. So things like hairsprays, gels, waxes, and these can actually increase the levels of ETPA that are found. And that's why the Society of Hair Testing don't recommend testing it for confirming abstinence, because it can be affected by other factors. So they're the two types of hair strand testing that we look at when testing for alcohol, your ETG and your ETPA. And this summarises them in a table. It makes it easier to understand. So for head hair testing, again, 1 centimetre per month. So the maximum amount of time we can look back is up to 12 months. So we'd need 12 centimetres of head hair to be able to do this. And you can opt for either an overview, which is as we spoke about earlier, or segmented month by month for this type of testing. So if you do the combined ETG and the ETPA, either overview or segmented, we'd be looking for excessive consumption and chronic and excessive consumption. And ideally between 3 and 6 months would be the ideal sample length to analyse, but we could go back up to 12 months if required. For ETG only, again, as an overview or segmented, we can test for excessive consumption and chronic and excessive consumption, but we can also test for abstinence in the head hair sample. Again, we'd recommend looking back the kind of 3 to 6 month time frame, but we can go up to 12 months if required. And we can segment that obviously monthly, bi-monthly or quarterly, depending on what your preference of that is. We can still offer some alternatives. So if your client doesn't have head hair to provide, we can test for ETG only in body hair, fingernails, toenails, and beard hair. For the body hair sample, we can take any type apart from underarm, so we wouldn't test underarm for alcohol. And it would be looking at both abstinence and chronic and excessive consumption, depending on which one you require. For beard hair, again, it's based on the length, but could go back up to 12 months as an overview. It would just be for chronic and excessive. And then for your finger or your toenails, we can do 6 or 12 months, depending on which one is available. And again, we can offer abstinence or chronic and excessive consumption. But with the nail sample, you would need to opt for an expert witness report for chronic and excessive usage in a nail sample. So just a few things to bear in mind when you're deciding what type of testing would be most suitable. It depends on what you're looking for in relation to abstinence or chronic and excessive consumption and what your client has available as well. Then we look at blood alcohol testing. So we do actually offer 4 different types of blood alcohol testing here at AlphaBiolabs. We offer PEth samples, CDT, MCV, and LFT. Again, considering what you're looking to determine from these types of sample. We'll go a little bit more into the PEth testing on the next slide. But all of the other blood tests can test for chronic and excessive consumption, and CDT can also test for excessive consumption. With CDT, MCV and LFT, you just need to consider that other factors can affect those results, as you can see in the right-hand side of that table. So it's worth bearing in mind when you're doing this type of test that you shouldn't do them in isolation. Ideally, you should do them together as a group or alongside your hair strand testing. The one we would recommend would be your PEth testing, which is the top one there. The reason for this is that it's a direct marker of alcohol. So unlike the other blood tests that I just touched on, this is only present once alcohol is being consumed. So it can monitor different things. So it can monitor your abstinence, social drinking. It can also do your chronic and excessive. It gives a better overall picture. It's also not affected by things like medication or any medical conditions, including pregnancy. So for the other 3 types of testing, we can't test anyone whilst pregnant or for the first 8 weeks after they've given birth. just because it can interfere with the testing results, whereas PEth isn't affected by this type of test. So we can do this at any point. It also means that we can offer this type of test via finger prick. So if you do have any needle phobic clients who are refusing to give bloods for that reason, solely for the PEth, we can offer finger prick testing. Unfortunately, we can't offer it for any of the other three. So it is the strongest out of the 4 blood samples, and it's the one that we would recommend the most, mainly because it's that direct marker of alcohol. If you were to do PEth testing and you were looking to do it over a longer period of time, we can also offer repeat testing for PEth. So we would take a blood sample every 4 weeks from the client, and then we can report that over a period of time. Again, just to help with monitoring an individual's drinking patterns so that you can see any trends or increase and decrease in drinking over a period of time. So really useful test, the PEth test, particularly when done alongside her testing to build up that bigger picture. So here they all are alongside one another with a few others that we've not quite touched on yet. So you can, of course, use a breathalyzer to do testing in certain circumstances, as it only covers kind of the here and now, what's in the system at the time the sample's done. Then you've got your blood tests. So from 1 month as an overview up to 4 months, depending on which one of those you opt for. And then your head, hair, body, hair, finger and toenail testing, similar to the drug period of analysis, so up to 12 months with a sufficient sample, with the exception of fingernails clippings, which is up to 6 months. Then you've got your PEth testing. So if you do that repeat, you could do that back as far as needed. So you can do that up to a period of 12 months or even longer if required. And that would give you an idea every month on someone's drinking habits. And then we've got our SCRAM alcohol bracelet, so your remote alcohol monitoring bracelet, which can be worn for any amount of time, usually a minimum of 30 days, up to a year, but it can be longer if required. I'm just going to really quickly touch on SCRAM before we move on to the Q&A session. So for those of you that aren't aware of it, it's a bracelet that's fitted to the ankle, and it takes a reading, a transdermal alcohol concentration through the skin every 30 minutes to give an idea of someone's drinking patterns over a period of time. It is 24/7 monitoring, and it feeds back into us here, and then we would pass that information on to yourselves once we got any drinking events. It can also detect if anyone's tampered with the bracelet, so if someone's tried to remove it or to put something between the sensor and the skin, so that you know they are being continuously monitored for the whole period of time. Once the reading comes through, it then converts it into a lower, medium or high level drinking event, and a report is then generated off the back of that. And you can have those reports as frequently or infrequently as required. But it's a really good way of monitoring someone ongoing over a period of time, and particularly useful in cases where someone maybe has custody of a child, but not all the time, and that they're allowed to drink when the child's not with them. This would be ideal for that situation because it allows you to monitor them for specific kind of every 30 minutes whilst the child's in their presence for any drinking that might have occurred. And then this is how they're classified. So they would classify them as low, medium or high level drinking events if and when detected. And then they would translate that into the peak TAC reading level. And then what that would be if it was a breath concentration, and typically how many units of alcohol would need to be consumed to make that drinking event trigger. So for a high level drinking event, it would be a minimum of 8 units of alcohol to hit that peak TAC reading. So really interesting, really useful in certain situations, again, just depending on what your client's looking to prove. And I'll hand you back over to Sam.
So the alcohol test results are presented in the same structured reporting format as the drug test results. So this just ensures consistency in our interpretation and the layout across both types of analysis. And in this section, we explore the use of head hair and blood testing and its interpretation using a real-world example. This case involved a 6-month overview of scalp hair for alcohol markers for chronic and excessive consumption, along with a PEth blood test. So in this case, the client disclosed 1 bottle of wine per week, no hair dye, but regular hairspray and heat straightener use. And you can see they disclosed medication. This medication would not have an effect on ETG or ETPA, or indeed the PEth in this case. ETG was reported at 40 picograms and ETPA was also positive. Both of these results are above the Society of Hair Testing cutoffs for chronic and excessive alcohol consumption. PEth was also very high at 449 nanograms per milliliter, which is consistent with excessive drinking in the month prior to sample collection. So although ETPA can be artificially elevated by alcohol-containing hair products like hairspray, ETG is unaffected by such products and therefore confirms excessive alcohol consumption. So in this case, in a follow-up query, the solicitor asked whether the binge drinking events during holidays abroad, which calculates to about 2 weeks of drinking events in total, could have caused the elevation in ETG and ETPA alongside the approximate 1 bottle of wine per week. But it was reiterated that the alcohol biomarkers reflect average drinking over the entire 6-month period. And it's not possible to specifically determine periods of binge drinking, social drinking, or abstinence within the time period investigated. And PEth itself only reflects the last month prior to sample collection. Furthermore, though, it was noted that PEth could not be influenced by holidays with drinking events that occurred 7 or more weeks before the sample collection. So in this case, the combination of hair alcohol biomarkers and PEth testing results meant that we could conclude that the disclosed binge drinking episodes alone would not account for the findings, unless such episodes were more frequent and intense than stated. This is further supported by the fact that the PEth remained elevated despite the binge events occurring more than 7 weeks prior to the sample collection. And the sample donor also declared a typical alcohol intake of only 1 bottle of wine per week. And for further testing and clarity, we advise monthly PEth testing, a scram cam monitored for real-time tracking, and optional repeat hair testing for updated analysis windows to exclude the binge drinking holiday events. But the overall interpretation is that there had been sustained chronic and excessive consumption within that time period investigated, and it was inconsistent with the disclosed moderate intake. So this is just an example of why full disclosure of sample history at the time of sample collection, alongside the combined use of hair alcohol biomarkers and PEth testing, is essential to ensure accurate interpretation, support a robust assessment of alcohol use patterns over time, and strengthen the reliability of conclusions by accounting for external influences and overlapping detection windows. And now I'll pass you back to Andrew, who will take charge of the Q&A session.
Well, thank you firstly very much to Ashley and Sam for your presentations there. We're just going to spend another 5 minutes answering a few questions. There have been quite a few coming during the presentation, so we're not going to have time to answer all of them, but we will answer a few now. For those of you that might have to drop off now because we're at the sort of 40-minute mark, just bear in mind you will get an email in 24 hours, so tomorrow, with a link to a recording of the slides. And also you'll be able to request a brand new information guide that we've just released, which shows you all the tables that have been in the webinar today. So we do appreciate there was a lot of information there. So I do strongly recommend you request one of the guides from us. We can either send it to you electronically or indeed a hard copy in the post. So you will get information about how to do that when you get the follow-up email tomorrow. Okay, so just going to cover a few questions here. And the first one is quite an interesting one for you, Sam. So the question is, how foolproof are these tests as clients frequently seek to challenge them?
So toxicology tests are highly robust when conducted by accredited laboratories like AlphaBiolabs, using validated methods, appropriate cutoffs, and chain of custody procedures. However, no test is entirely foolproof. At AlphaBiolabs, our interpretation always considers factors like sample integrity, possible external contamination, individual pharmacokinetics, and the limitations of the biological matrix being tested. So whilst challenges can be raised, when testing is performed correctly and interpreted appropriately, the results are legally defensible and backed by international standards like the SOHG and UCAS ISO 17025 accreditation. So this ensures that the evidence we provide is both scientifically sound and court appropriate.
Thank you, Sam. Another question for yourself on drug testing. If a client is having close contact with someone who is a heavy drug user, could this contaminate the client, leading to a positive drug result?
So whilst close contact with a heavy drug user is still unlikely to result in a reportable positive result on its own, it may contribute to the results obtained under certain conditions. At AlphaBiolabs, drug results in hair are only reported as positive when the detected concentrations exceed both the Society of Hair Testing cutoffs and where applicable, and the laboratory's higher analytical cutoffs, which account for measurement uncertainty. Additionally, we have decontamination washes, which are applied during analysis to minimize the risk of surface contamination. We have metabolite detection, which is necessary to support evidence of systemic ingestion. And then we have interpretation, which considers the drug profile, the metabolite ratios, segmental trends, and the context of use or exposure. So whilst passive exposure alone is unlikely to exceed the reporting thresholds, especially when metabolites are present, it may contribute to the overall findings and must be considered in context.
Thanks, Sam. Next question for yourself, Ashley. It's in relation to sample collections. So the question or the comment was, testing should not be the defining aspect of a case, yet in the family court, a statement of use is rarely provided. Why don't testers insist on such a declaration before testing?
We do, I guess, is the short of it. It's definitely a question that we ask on the collection form. So whenever we go and visit someone for both drug and alcohol testing, we will ask them if it's drug testing for any drug use that they've had in the time frame that's covered by the analysis, so be that 3, 6, 12 months. We also ask them if they believe that they've been passively exposed to any drug use. If they've had a close encounter, like you say, with another person who is a drug user. And then for alcohol, we ask them if they are abstinent from use, if so, when from, and we also ask for the typical intake in a week. So we do ask them this in the hope that they'll be completely honest with us. We know that's not always the case. And then for anyone who's completed the form, they get an emailed copy of it if they've opted in. So they need to opt in for that. And then they get 48 hours to read through what they've disclosed and make any amendments that they'd like to before that's then passed on to Sam and her team, who then incorporate that within that expert report. So I'm not sure if that result refers to a specific case where maybe the client didn't want to disclose any use, but it's definitely something we ask them for. We can't force them into it. But yeah, we agree. It needs to be a bigger overall picture, and that's why we ask those questions.
Thanks, Ashley. Okay, just a couple more questions before we finish, both for yourself, Sam. The first one is, why can there be no overlap in head hair testing periods?
So this is because hair growth isn't perfectly uniform. It varies between individuals, between different areas on the body, and even between segments within the same sample. So factors like cosmetic treatments, natural growth variability, and differences in hair compositions can all affect how drugs or alcohol biomarkers appear in the hair. This means that even if no new use has occurred, you may still see fluctuating concentrations between collections. So if test periods overlap, it can distort the trend and complicate interpretation, especially when trying to track changes in use over time. So by ensuring that testing periods are non-overlapping, we improve clarity, comparability, and the forensic reliability of the results.
Thanks, Sam. And just conscious of time, so the last question is with regard to blood alcohol testing. Is PEth testing ever a suitable testing option to be done in isolation, such as to show a month-by-month analysis? And what are the benefits of undertaking hair strand testing as well?
So PEth testing in isolation may be appropriate for assessing alcohol consumption in the prior 4 weeks, for example, particularly if recent use is in question. And whilst PEth is not segmentable like hair, monthly PEth testing can effectively reflect a person's average alcohol intake over each approximate 4-week period, so allowing month-by-month trends to be tracked over time. So this makes PETH suitable for monitoring ongoing drinking behaviour, particularly in absence or relapse monitoring programmes. Hair strand testing can be segmented into 1 centimetre sections to provide a month-by-month history over a longer time period. So using PETH in combination with hair testing offers both a short-term and long-term view of alcohol use, which strengthens the overall evidence base and mitigates the limitations of either method in isolation. So, for example, PETH is metabolically eliminated and has a defined blood half-life of between 4 and 10 days, whereas ETG and ETPA in hair persist until the hair sheds naturally, making them long-term markers without a true half-life in those matrices. So one key advantage of combining both tests is that ETG and ETPA in hair cannot be rapidly eliminated and reflect longer-term use, whilst PETH is eliminated more quickly after drinking ceases. So therefore, a change in PETH concentrations across serial samples may help demonstrate whether drinking behaviour has changed recently, even before this is reflected in the hair growth.
That's brilliant. Thanks very much, Sam. Okay, and thanks to all of you that have asked questions today. Apologies if we didn't get a chance to answer yours, but as I said earlier, we will send you an email with a response. So just to finish off then, well, firstly, thanks very much for your time today. We will be issuing a very short survey, so if you could kindly, just before you log off, it will appear on your screen. If you can answer the 3 or 4 questions on there, it just helps us for future planning of these webinars. I did mention before as well that there is an option to request from us our brand new information guide, which covers all the testing options that Ashley and Sam have talked about today. In the survey, you can actually request it, whether you want the electronic copy or a hard copy. It's all explained in there. And also, as another option, if you don't have time to complete the survey, you will get an email from us tomorrow, and that will also give you the opportunity to request one of these brand new information guides. So thanks very much again for your time today. Please do get in touch with us. We are the experts in drug, alcohol, and DNA testing. You can see our key methods of communication there, including social media. If you're on LinkedIn or X, please do give us a follow and we will follow you back. And yeah, thanks again. Have a great day, and we look forward to seeing you soon on the next series of AlphaBiolabs webinars. Thanks very much, and goodbye.